Hello, my name is Nikita Grebnev, and I'm covering the final project of the Data Manipulation Techniques course. Today's topic is renewable energy, and I want to explore its viability, how much is it currently used, and how much it can be used in the nearest future. Lately, due to an increasing interest towards renewable sources of energy, there has been a spike in various reports and surveys concerning the production, storage, and consumption of energy. The topic itself became quite politicized and is used left and right in conjunction with political ideas, which I'm gonna try to avoid. Furthermore, a lot of the published data addresses not really insightful information taken from a variety of countries and situations so broad that it could be as well an average temperature of all patients in a hospital, as a result providing confusing forecasts, each different from the last. This could be explained in many ways: the complexity of the topic, the research bias of the researchers, different expectations of the researchers and those who ordered the survey, the topic being politicized and controversial to some, and difference in understanding what renewable even means. This means that the choice of sources needs to be carefully curated, and for that I decided to look into international agencies and data they present. Let's start with the biggest one first, the list of renewable energy power stations. This data package is focused on existing European renewable power plants, their location, power sources, technologies used, owners, capacity and pricing, all the way up to 2020. It covers Czech Republic, Denmark, France, Germany, Poland, Sweden, Switzerland and United Kingdom. And it's very good for separating sources and covering their viability and popularity. The second one is a wider, but at the same time less profound look into economic indicators of countries within the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The data it hosts seems credible and covers the period from 2000 to 2018. Third and fourth, we have statistics on renewable energy output in Sub-Saharan Africa and Europe. The data itself is taken from World Bank and British Petroleum, but the British Petroleum sources are only used to get fuel prices at various times within the range from 1990 to 2015. Although taken separately, all of the aforementioned sources are very neatly packed and cleaned and ready for analysis. Together they present a mess of unlinked data. At this point, a single database needs to be created, one which would incorporate all of the various sources into one, that could be used to peek into details of international usage of renewable energy. I used a web hosting that comes with a pre-installed MySQL database service that can be easily connected to platforms such as Tableau. Thankfully, the renewable power plants dataset already came packed in an SQL database, which could be easily converted to MySQL and expanded to host all the different sources. Still, this was a lot of work, picking data from the sources and making sure that all the measures, regional identifiers, dimensions, etc. stayed the same, modifying them when needed. Especially the types of data. The types are always picky. After a few hours of conversion and checking, the primary database was ready. Then I started adding the comparison data from OECD. Finally, data on Europe and Africa are going in separate scope to be later used for comparison. I used a web hosting that comes with a pre-installed MySQL database service that can be easily connected to platforms such as Tableau. The hosting is called Comatera and is presented in the sources section of the presentation. The final stage of the treatment was completed after I connected the data to Tableau. Since the different views of the data required me to include or exclude different values, I utilized the filtering options on the charts. There have been a few questions I wanted to be answered. How dependent is the world used to be on the fossil fuels, and how is it now? Is the nuclear option even an option? What other alternatives do we have? What experience do we have with them? How are they distributed? To answer the first questions, let us take a look at the relationship between the oil production, oil being a good indicator on fossil fuel usage, and basically our most beloved source of delicious carbon dioxide, and the energy generation. Naturally, not all of the extracted natural oil is used in production of energy. There are various plastics, mechanical oils, paints, and other chemical compounds produced by the plastics industry. However, the percent of oil used in fuel production and energy generation tends to stay the same, so we can try to find a relation. Is the increase in oil production followed by the increase in energy generation? The short answer is no. The long answer might be that the increase in amount of fuel doesn't affect the energy generation that much, due to the consumption of energy staying pretty much the same. There is no reason to produce more energy when there's no one demanding it. However, while researching this question, I noticed something interesting. While the production of oil was fluctuating, the relationship between total and renewable energy generation stayed pretty steady. However, while researching this question, I noticed something interesting. While the production of oil was fluctuating, the relationship between total and renewable energy generation stayed pretty steady. This might mean that the renewable sector of energy market doesn't change due to external factors, indicating its stability. The obvious assumption would be then that if the sector is so stable, it cannot grow proportionate to the growth of the power demand. Let's explore this possibility. Here are two maps of Europe and Africa, with countries colored in accordance to their average yearly consumption of energy. The darker the coloration is, the more energy is consumed, on average in a year. If we hover over each country, we can also see the average percent of the renewable energy used in this country. In case of European countries, the data is a little bit more specified due to its obtainability. With African countries, the theory holds up. We can see that less industrial countries such as Ethiopia, Mali, and Congo can allow themselves to rely heavily on the renewable sources of energy, while more industrial countries with higher demands such as Namibia and South Africa cannot. But when we look at European countries, the situation is vastly different. Here we can see that less industrious countries like Poland and Netherlands rely more on the fossil fuels, while more industrious and more demanding Germany and France rely more and more on the nuclear and renewable sources of energy. This can indicate that while demand of electricity certainly dictates the production of it, it doesn't necessarily dictate the sources out of which the electricity is taken. On examples of South Africa and Germany, we can see that it's the level of development of heavily demanding countries and the technologies that are spread there that dictate the usage of one source or another. Just to be clear that we are looking at the correct data with these countries, I plotted few charts. On the left, you can see the usage of energy by various African countries and their CO2 emissions, while the least demanding countries being filtered out. On the right, we have the same charts for the European countries. If we were to hover over these lines, we can see the distribution of energy production as well, specifically the percent of renewable energy in total power production of the country. As well, in Europe, we have the more specified distribution of energy. In Africa, specifically three countries caught my eye: South African Republic, Gabon, and Mauritius. In case of South African Republic, their energy consumption stayed rather high, as well as their CO2 emissions. But we can see that when the country utilized more renewable sources, the emissions lowered, and when they utilized less renewable sources, they grew. In case of Mauritius, we can see the slow and steady growth of consumption, and it also was followed by steady growth in emissions, while the amount of renewable sources used diminished. But Gabon, on the other hand, experienced a spurt of growth since 2000, but their emissions went down. At the same time, the percent of renewable energy in total production of the country grew as well. Despite them getting more and more energy, they managed to cope with the increasing demand without increasing the pollution, but rather increasing the usage of renewable sources. The same trend can be seen in European countries as well. France relies on nuclear on almost 3/4 of their total production and has negligible emissions, while countries like Germany and UK still get more than half a quarter of energy from fossils and have the topmost emissions on the continent. It's simple, really. The ability to switch to the more sustainable and renewable sources of energy comes at a price, literally. The more GDP a country has, the more money it has, the easier for this country it is to stay clean. Here on the top we can see African countries, the three that I discussed earlier being the topmost wealthiest countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. At the same time, these three are the most consuming ones. Considering the previous questions, and considering the previous conclusions, that the more developed a country is, the easier it is for it to use renewable sources, we can see how Gabon still outmatches in wealth and cleanliness both of South African Republic and Mauritius, even though they come close. On the lower chart, we can see the same situation in Europe. Norway has the biggest GDP per capita, and at the same time, it has the cleanest air. Only 2% of its production comes from fossil. After an abyss of nothingness, we have Sweden with the same situation, and then Netherlands and Germany that are slowly getting rid of fossil fuels in favor of renewable sources. Finally, we have France with 77% of its energy right now coming from nuclear fuel. This surprised me. Honestly, I didn't think of France as of a nuclear country. And especially, I didn't expect to see such a number in Europe after the horrible mistake that was made 50 years ago and the consequences in finance and health that it has for Europe to this day. And that is the next question that I wanted to examine. What is the nuclear sector of energy production? Can a country get rid of it without losing its energy production and diminishing its energy consumption? First thing that surprised me was that despite the tragedy of 1986 in Chernobyl, the nuclear energy market continued to grow, and in some countries, by the time of 2020, it's still occupying almost a fifth of the total energy production market. However, the more modern tragedy occurred in Japan in 2011, and that clearly shows on the chart. As you can see, the production of electricity by the nuclear sector in Japan dropped significantly. Yet the total production stayed the same, again confirming that the electricity production depends on demand way more than it depends on technologies and production of fuel. Japan simply shifted to other sources of energy. If I were to put it in layman's terms, nobody really cares that much that they might be sitting on a dirty bomb ready to blow until a disaster strikes. And if handled correctly, it shouldn't strike, right? But there are always safer options. What if the local or international resolutions forbid the use of nuclear options due to its inherent danger, and the territory doesn't provide oil or gas? Some places buy the fuel abroad, but that gets tricky on a political scale, and also puts the buyer in a dependent position to the seller. If the seller were to figuratively or literally turn the valve and cut the fuel supply, there has to be other options. That is another bonus of renewable power sources. They only depend on the planet and the sun. And European countries studied and experimented with such sources for a while. Let's take a closer look. Within the European Union, Germany went the furthest in attempts on getting steady renewable supply of energy, recently even overtaking their nuclear production. United Kingdom and France follow suit, and the amount of other countries is negligible. However, turning back to the nuclear options, we can see that France's nuclear supply is more than 10 to 1, making Germany a way better case to study the viability of the renewable options. Let's see what these options are. Immediately, solar and wind power plants become noticeable on the left chart. On the right one, the technologies are separated into more specified groups, such as wind turbines separated into onshore and offshore, and bioenergy separated into biogas, pumped storage, and sewage and landfill gas. It seems that, again, Germany has the most diversified assets, as well as the largest amounts of renewable sources. Most of them, however, are centered on either collection of solar energy or utilization of the wind. This might suggest that the renewable energy is dependent on location, and we can check that on the next slide. Here we can see the distribution of renewable energy production and the technologies used in different parts of Germany. The production is mostly tied to the population of the region and the demand for electricity, again supporting the earlier conclusion, while technologies are spread rather equally. The only two technologies that seem to truly depend on the location are geothermal supply, requiring source of geothermal activity, and offshore wind turbines requiring obviously existence of a shore to place them off. All of the others are distributed rather equally. Solar panels being utilized in small amounts all across the country. They only need the light. Biogas and sewage are available wherever there is a city to fill them. Hydro turbines only require a river, and often not even a big one. Small turbines can be placed in a daisy chain structure, basically dangling in the running water. Finally, wind turbines only require wind, and a high enough location to place them. Germany, being pretty hilly, has enough hills to place windmills on. This distribution shows that with enough creativity, you can find renewable sources of energy basically anywhere. My expectations when starting this project were quite pessimistic, and I'm glad that the data proved me wrong. Summing up the answers, the world's energy production isn't dependent on fossil fuels anymore than it depends on the demand. The nuclear option, while still being viable, still can be removed without hurting the country's total production. The alternatives we have are abundant and don't seem to be dependent on the location. And finally, experience shows that when thought is put into them, they can become a viable option. With those technologies and diminishing dependence on fossil and nuclear fuel, we very well might be on our way to a sustainable, renewable source of energy. On these final charts, you can see that the growth and expansion of renewable sources only speed up over the last year, often outpacing the total growth of the energy production. Honestly, I can't believe how optimistic I sound. I would like to thank you for taking this dive with me. And also, I would like to thank all the people that collected this data. Here, in the end of the presentation, you can find all the sources I used. The MySQL web service I used is called Comatera and should be available with the credentials I attached to this assignment. And in this file, you can find the Tableau story with the graphs I showed here. Thank you again for watching, and take care.